Okay, this is the first case study of the sixth topic, which is on the Hungarian Revolution. The sixth topic looks at how secure Soviet hold over the areas in Eastern Europe it took between 1945 and roughly 1989. The Hungarian Uprising of 1956 is a rather detailed event, but one that shows exactly the lengths to which the Soviets would go to ensure that they controlled all of the areas of Eastern Europe that they had come in contact with. So in order to get into the background, let's talk about Hungary, a country that you probably haven't had too much exposure to other than the fact that you know that it was occupied by the Soviets in 1945 and by 1948 had a government that was loyal to the Soviets through one way or another. But let's get into how that happened. So after World War II, of course, Hungary, which had been a Nazi ally, was jointly occupied by the United States, the United Kingdom, and the USSR by something known as the Allied Control Commission for Hungary. The USSR was the most influential because of course, it was their army that occupied the country of Hungary. And as such, they were able to determine post-war events. The Soviets backed a provisional government, which was set up, and this provisional government, without really being asking the people or consulting anyone, was effectively forced by the Soviets to pay $300 million in reparations for the damage done by the Hungarians fighting with the Nazis in the Soviet Union during the Second World War. Now, Hungary doesn't automatically fall into the realm of Soviet control. In fact, for a short period of time, mostly due to the fact that the Allies had a good degree of influence in there, it looked like Hungary could be another country like Austria that could hold on to some degree of autonomy. And in November 1947, elections are held. Even though the Soviets forbid elections in other places, such as Poland, for example, in Hungary, elections were allowed to be held. And a non-communist party, known as the Smallholders Party, won 57% of the vote and got a majority in the Hungarian parliament. The Soviet general in charge of the occupation, however, refused to allow them to take power. The Soviets, I suppose, were fine with elections as long as the result was what they wanted. And when the result didn't turn out to be what they wanted, the Soviets sort of stepped in. The smallholders were forced into a coalition with the Hungarian Communist Party, which is something that they didn't want, and a Communist Party member, Laszlo Rajak, was put in charge of the security police, meaning that the Soviet Russians would have almost complete dominance over what happened in Hungary, even though technically speaking, the Smallholders Party was nominally in power. Now, what really happens over the next few years is a slow devolution into total Soviet control. By February 1947, members of the Smallholders Party are arrested, and others will flee Hungary. And actually, that should be February of 1948. And in the following elections, it sees the Communist Party win a majority government. Of course, those following elections were rigged, and there was lots of intimidation by Soviet soldiers and so on and so forth at the ballot box. Okay, this new Soviet government, after the sort of forced removal of the Smallholders Party, draws up a constitution which makes Hungary a republic of workers and working peasants. In other words, it takes a very similar name to that of the Soviet Union, indicating very strongly that this will be a Soviet republic. This new republic is led by a man named Matthias Rákosi. And Matthias Rákosi is the leader of the Communist Party and a horrible and oppressive dictator who models his rule and models his political career after his idol, Joseph Stalin, the harsh and brutal dictator of the time of the Soviet Union. He calls himself, as I said, a follower of Stalin, and Hungary becomes a member immediately of Cominform, which means that Hungary now is going to take its leadership and its direction from the Soviet Union. Matthias Rákosi, let's give a little background on this guy. He's quite important. Rákosi, a Hungarian politician. He was a supporter of Stalin. He was seen as, they called him a safe pair of hands because he would turn Hungary into a Soviet state, and they could trust, as long as Rákosi was in power, that Hungary would remain completely dominated by the communists. Rákosi goes on. He believed, of course, like I said, he was a follower of Stalin, therefore he believed in using repression and terror to effectively get what he wants and to keep control. In Hungary, Rákosi will purge or kill an estimated 2,000 people. 200,000 political opponents are put in prison. Like in the Soviet Union, Rákosi will create a secret police known as the AVH. These people were a hated and dreaded part of everyday life in Hungary, as they sort of spied on people. They used the networks of informants, and this really was the organization that spread terror, or Soviet terror, and conformity amongst the people through terror in Hungary. Like in the Soviet Union, communism doesn't believe that religion has any part in the lives of people, and religious teaching is removed from the education systems. And in Hungary, the Catholics, the overwhelming majority of Hungarians are Roman Catholics, and in Hungary, the Cardinal Mindzentry, the leader of the Catholic Church in Hungary, a staunch opponent of communists, very publicly, is thrown in prison without trial for life. The Soviet control, because it joins Cominform, it will also join the Council for Mutual Economic Assistance, known as Comecon. The Hungarian economy is completely aligned in the Soviet model. Comecon controls this economy and prevents Hungary, like all of the other states in Western Europe, from receiving Marshall aid, though it desperately needs it and wants it. It's also forced to trade on uneven terms with the Soviet Union. It's supposed to effectively give the Soviet Union all of the things that they make and in turn get very little back. They didn't receive a fair price for the things that they exported, and as a result, the Hungarian economy at the time of Rákosi suffered greatly. Rákosi institutes, to try and fix the economy, a Soviet-style 5-year plan. In the Soviet Union, Stalin had, in the 1930s, issued a number of, starting in the 1920s actually, and throughout the 1930s, issued a number of decrees known as the 5-year plans. And the 5-year plans are effectively to bring the economy up to speed in a very small period of time. And the first 5-year plan was focused on increasing Hungary's ability to produce steel, coal, and iron ore. However, Rákosi leads this very badly, and the organizations that are set up to run the economy are very poor, and it doesn't really work. What's more, actually, is that the Hungarian economy becomes dangerously imbalanced or unbalanced. They produce so much steel and so much iron ore that they actually don't produce other things that people need. People can't get access to basic consumer goods, which means living standards drop. Let me give you an example. The access to things like a refrigerator, pretty much a common staple, almost a necessity in every modern home, is pretty much restricted because there are no refrigerators available for Hungary. Anything that is made is mostly coal, iron ore, and steel, which is shipped to the Soviet Union and used to produce whatever they need at the expense of the people of Hungary. And as such, Rákosi becomes incredibly unpopular. When Stalin dies in 1953, though, things start to look up for the Hungarian people, and they start to believe that things could change. Now, Stalin, of course, we know is a brutal dictator who ruled through terror, and if you think that Rákosi ruled through terror, well, then if you can also consider the fact that the Hungarian government, which he led, was effectively terrorized by Stalin. So things were, pretty heavy-handed. But when he dies, the new Soviet leader actually becomes Khrushchev, but the caretaker leader, while the leadership contest is going on, is a guy named Malenkov. He didn't really like Rákosi and actually has him replaced with a man named Imre Nagy. Now it looks like Nagy, but it's Nagy. And he's replacing Rákosi in March of 1953. And it's probably a good idea at this particular time to take a pen and make notes of exactly who is the leader of Hungary, because it sort of flips back and forth here for a little bit. Because Nagy, when he takes over, scares the new Soviet leadership because he's too liberal and too Western, and his ideas are too much like the United States. And he himself is soon replaced again with Rákosi. So Rákosi's kicked out, Nagy is brought back in. Nagy is too liberal, Rákosi's put back in. And in April 1945, when Nikita Khrushchev finally replaces Malenkov and takes over for an extended period of time the leadership of the Soviet Union, Hungary is forced to join the Warsaw Pact in 1955. Now, in February 1956, Khrushchev, in his new position as the leader of the Soviet Communist Party, makes what's known as the secret speech. And in the secret speech, Khrushchev will attack Stalin. He'll blame Stalin for much of the problems of the Soviet Union and much of the problems it's facing. And as a result, people start to get the impression that under Khrushchev, this new leader, things are going to change. Okay? They might have an opportunity to get rid of their own Stalinist leaders and have somebody who's more open-minded, like Khrushchev seems to be. So under Khrushchev, the Soviet Union comes under pressure from the Hungarian people. And Khrushchev takes a look at the situation in Hungary and replaces Rákosi once again with a man named Erno Garo. Okay, and he actually is a close friend of Rákosi, and it's hoped that this sort of token change would help appease the Hungarian people and make them more happy with their lot in communism. Victims of Rákosi's purges are symbolically reburied under Garo by people hoping to put the terror of the Rákosi era behind them. But things that are happening in the larger Soviet bloc start to push the Hungarians more and more towards a point of unhappiness. In August and September 1956, unrest in Poland breaks out, which leads to the communist government there to give some reforms sanctioned by Khrushchev. And of course, this encourages the people of Hungary to demand reforms of their own. The unrest in Hungary is not helped by the fact that in 1956 the harvest is extremely poor. So with their rather lousy economy and now they're on the brink of starvation, the Hungarians start to become very, very displeased. Not to mention the fact that in addition to this, fuel, such as coal for heating your homes and gas for cars and engines and so on and so forth, also starts to fall into short supply. And really what you get is a recipe for resentment and potential rebellion. On the 23rd of October 1956, students and workers in Budapest start to hold a demonstration. And they start to make demands of the government, okay? And their demands are, more free and open. We want free elections again, et cetera, et cetera. And of course, these demands are rejected. And in fact, on the 23rd of October 1956, the police will shoot into the crowd, which will kill and injure just a small number of people, but ultimately lead to the beginning of what becomes known as the Hungarian Uprising. People take to the streets in protest of the harshness of the Soviet rule, and troops and tanks are sent in to calm these protests. The following day, the USSR, alarmed at what's going on in Hungary, will actually replace Garo, not Rákosi, Garo once again with Imre Nagy, the guy who had been in for a short period of time but was unpopular and replaced earlier by Rákosi, who was then replaced by Garo, who is now replaced by Nagy once again. So you see how that gets a bit confusing. The Hungarians start to believe and think that their time is now. In fact, at one point, the leader of Hungary, Nagy, begins to talk with the Soviet Union and ask them to start removing their tanks. At the same time, in a speech, U.S. Secretary of State John Foster Dulles told the Hungarians on the radio that you can count on us. In fact, the Americans used to pump propaganda into the East all the time. They used something known as Radio Free America, which was broadcast via shortwave radio into the homes of people all over the Soviet Eastern Bloc. And they would broadcast in their own language. And Don Foster Dulles' speech to the Hungarians is, of course, translated into Hungarian and blared into every home. And it basically says, you can count on the United States. And the Hungarians wrongly believed that they had the support of the USA against the USSR. So if they rebelled, the USA might come in and support them militarily. Okay. However, President Eisenhower, who had succeeded Truman in 1953, was pretty wary of getting into a war, especially in a year in which an election was being held. And therefore, John Foster Dulles had really spoke out of turn and actually got into quite a bit of trouble for that. Now, Nagy also sees that this is the time to sort of relax the tensions. Nagy releases political prisoners, the ones who had been imprisoned by Rákosi, some 200,000 people, including the head of the Catholic Church in Hungary, Cardinal Menzin Zentry, on the 30th of October 1956. On Halloween Day, the 31st of October, he proposes reforms which would include taking Hungary out of the Warsaw Pact, that military alliance against the West. He also goes to the United Nations and asks them to support the Hungarians. Political parties that were banned were allowed to come back on the 3rd of November. And Nagy forms a coalition with the Smallholders Party, who had been expelled as of 1948 and effectively kicked out of the country. And Hungary looks like it's about to fall and become a democracy, at least a democracy that it intended to be. Now, Khrushchev's response is pretty harsh. He didn't want to be seen as weak by members of the Warsaw Pact. In fact, at this exact time, the leader of China, the communist leader of China in 1956, Mao Zedong, who is concerned with keeping the faith of his own people, calls Khrushchev and says, "You must stand against any deviation from communism," and encourages Khrushchev to really drive a hard line and crush the Hungarian uprising. And on the 4th of November, Khrushchev decides that the threat of the removal of Hungary to the Warsaw Pact is too much to take. 200,000 Soviet troops and 600,000 tanks are returned to Hungary, and an armed conflict breaks out between the protesters in the streets and the Soviet army. The Hungarians actually fight back quite bravely. They use guerrilla tactics, Molotov cocktails to attack Soviet tanks, but effectively they're overwhelmed. And by the 10th of November, any Hungarian resistance is completely destroyed, and a ceasefire is agreed to, which ends the rebellion. Now, this ceasefire really is the end of opposition in Hungary, because what we see very clearly here, the result of any sort of disturbance, is the Soviets crack down in a big way. Hungary doesn't receive the world attention that it demanded and thought it would help. One of the other reasons, apart from Eisenhower not getting involved because it was election year, is that the British actually at this particular time, with their help of the French and the Israelis, actually invade Egypt in what becomes known as the Suez Crisis. And this is a retaliation to Egyptian President Nasser's nationalization of what they believed was a British and French asset, the Suez Canal. The USA has to step in, the United Nations actually has to step in and issue a broker an agreement. The planned British invasion of the Suez goes very badly. It's a big mess. The bottom line is the Western countries are in their own mess, and they're not willing to really back up the Hungarians. And this allows the Soviet Union to get extremely repressive. Imre Nagy is arrested. He actually hides in the Yugoslavian embassy, hoping that Marshal Tito will protect him, but eventually he's turned over and turned into Qatar and taken to Romania, where he's shot in 1958. János Kadar, and I sort of skipped that point, is appointed Hungary's new leader, and he is a hard line, very much a man who follows the Rákosi-Stalin model of leadership, and a man who will keep a very firm hand on the situation in Hungary and not allow any sort of freedom or resistance to happen once again. So what's significant about this? Number one, the Soviets easily defeat the rebels. 20,000 of the rebels are killed. Khrushchev is able to secure control of Hungary. A new Soviet leader is put in place. Opposition is effectively crushed. In fact, 200,000 Hungarians flee the country, many to the United Kingdom, many to the United States, many to France, Canada, and other places. But the Soviet Union basically purges Hungary of anybody who's against it. The Soviet maintains its empire and sends a very strong warning to any of the satellite states, be it Czechoslovakia, Poland, Romania, and even to their neighbors and new communist friends, China, that they are willing to go to extreme lengths to secure the hold of the Soviet Union over the states of Eastern Europe, which are in its satellite or sphere of influence. It also shows that Khrushchev's sort of policy of de-Stalinization would only go a limited distance. And the West really starts to see Khrushchev and this message that we can live together peacefully with the West, something that actually comes out of the secret speech, something known as peaceful coexistence, as really a sham. And that, Khrushchev was just saying these things, and for Khrushchev, they were just words. Any sort of intention he really had of allowing freedom in the Soviet sphere of influence was rather limited. And as such, the significance of the Hungarian uprising very much shows that they were able to retain a very firm hold on power through brutality, as evidenced by the crushing of the Hungarian rebellion. Very interesting article you should read. There are a few articles I'll put up with this ad modo. The one on peaceful coexistence and the nature of Khrushchev's secret speech. It's a little bit more of a challenging reading, but if you're up for an interesting read and a challenge, I suggest strongly taking a look at that amongst the other ones that we'll be up with.